But insofar as New York is concerned, the interesting thing is that New York is reflective of the national view on legalization. And that's actually why what I'm about to say is so surprising. The national view, according to some of the latest polling, is about 67% of the country nationwide favors legalization of cannabis. Um, so we are way past the point, the tipping point in terms of the floodgates opening. And we note that even in the vice presidential debate last week, Kamala Harris went out of her way to point out that on day one, I think she said day one, that they would be decriminalizing cannabis, which is the beginning of how you get the populace to say, okay, decriminalized and then fully legal and part of a market. So we think the floodgates are going to open, and in New York, the floodgates have been bursting for a very long time. So one would say, well, if 67% nationwide favor it and something probably north of that in New York, I don't have that statistic handy, favor legalization, then why is this not a no-brainer for the legislators? And the reason turns on the usual controversies that you'd expect from a political arena. And it really boils down to, where's the money going to go, right? Right now, there are billions of dollars flowing underground in what we call the legacy market, which is basically the market that does not have legal status, but that makes New York probably one of the biggest unofficial marketplaces for cannabis in the world. The goal is to take all of that revenue and bring it above ground, which obviously not only is good for the state's economy, generating much needed taxes, but also generating legal jobs, including with the ancillary markets. So all of the economics point to this being a no-brainer, as well as legislators aren't really taking a risk by voting for something that's so popular. But the issue then boils down to, well, if we're going to spend the money, and this goes to the heart of our times right now, is the money going to be set aside in a big fund for, just public works projects? There was talk of it going to revitalize the subways, for example. But one of the main things that you'll hear from advocates for legalization in New York, I would say probably nationally, and I would guess internationally, is that a lot of that money needs to be reinvested in those communities that have been ravaged by the war on drugs. I'm recalling a Vox headline from 2 years ago, before New York implemented a larger form of decriminalization, that the arrest rate for non-whites was 8-1 compared to whites for marijuana possession. And that's despite the fact that relative rates of usage are equal. That is just a single statistic that identifies what we already know. And so many people who are advocating for legalization want a commitment by the state that they're going to take those tax dollars and they're going to put them into programs that will prioritize giving licenses and opportunities to those communities. It's a very, very important goal. And we have competing versions of the legislation. In one aspect, the governor's version of it has a more generally applicable fund. It does speak to the concept, the phrase used to social equity. It does say that that's a priority as part of this proposed legislation, but it doesn't commit to exactly where the money's going to go and how. And what New York is afraid of, and I think there's good cause for this concern, is that despite the language being right and saying we need to favor those programs, we've seen other states go online with similar language. And just by way of example, Massachusetts, who I think has gotten a lot of it right, we had a forum through our association a couple of weeks ago with a speaker from Massachusetts who pointed out that even though Massachusetts had a similar program, it was only recently, in the last few months, that the first wholly Black-owned businesses got a license, a cannabis business. And that's despite the fact that dispensaries have now been open for over a year in Massachusetts. So that is a big problem to be solved. And the governor's version, which sort of says we're going to put that out for another day, and the legislature's version, which speaks more to the issue, but also doesn't concretely identify how the money is going to be spent in ways that a lot of the advocates want it to be. Those are really, that's kind of the battleground. And now with civil rights playing the cardinal role that it is playing and is needed to play for a long time in our national consciousness and our state consciousness, this is the time to get it right, because we really can't delay not only the economic stimulus, but the economic stimulus going in the right directions. So those are the big issues. But at this point, I think, given the fact that New Jersey has a referendum pending, to legalize it this election, New York is going to be surrounded by states that have now legalized cannabis markets. Vermont, Massachusetts, it'll be New Jersey, very, very, very likely. And so when you look at the fact that all the revenue from the legal market is going everywhere but New York, coupled with the fact that New York certainly needs this stimulus and needs to address, those cardinal social issues, it's a perfect storm in terms of this needing to happen now. And I think that the New York government is understanding that.
Okay. Very good. Thank you for that. And Liz, if I can come to you next and just ask you about the kind of situation that you have with advocacy in New York in itself. You were just talking there, Andrea, about how New York's kind of going to be surrounded by these other states who, have kind of opened the floodgates, as you said, and accepted it, and they've made their decision. What on the ground advocacy, what kind of work is being put into kind of getting this over the line, particularly with your two industry associations where they're concerned?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I know, and Andrew touched on it a bit. It's interesting, the governor has said, just to sort of add a little bit to what Andrew had said as well, the governor has always said he would sign a bill if it came to his desk. The problem has been, as Andrew was sort of saying, there's different versions of the bill. And then how the bill that's sort of from the legislature bill, which is the MRTA, where the other governor's bill is the CRTA. The MRTA addresses more of the social equity and the social justice programs. It touches on it. But the interesting thing about the advocacy here, I think, is that there's different advocate groups, and they come from different segments of the industry, whether they're actually legacy market guys or whether they're, sort of different advocacy groups that have been around for many, many years on the topics of drugs. There's different opinions on how much needs to be set forth in the actual legislation versus what can we put into the rules. Because, typically it'll say we're going to legalize marijuana adult use program, and then they'll kick it off to like the Department of Health, or, I think in New York State, we're going to have a Bureau of Cannabis Affairs type thing, where there will be one person in charge of sort of promulgating the rules, which would be proposing the rules to each, to the state, to the legislators, and then the counties. So in New York State, technically we could, as counties can opt in or out in the current forms of the bills, we can opt in or out of whether we want the cannabis business in our region or our county. So depending on how, that all plays out, but the rules will actually state then, okay, whether there's going to be a percentage of the revenues going to an actual local program, which the MRTA does set forth a small percentage of the taxes going to, come into those local communities where they're going to help with programs. But it's about what programs, what are the programs, and how is it a loan for, disadvantaged folks to get started on the business? But if they've never done the business before, is that a wise investment of your money? They need to be mentored, they need to be taught. So it's sort of like how much gets baked into the actual legislation to make sure that it happens. Because I think the fear of the advocacy groups is that we punt it to another day and leave it to the agencies, whatever agency it might be that's in charge of these rules, and what we want doesn't get in it. It gets sort of, things roll on and big money comes into the industry and just plows ahead. And what I've seen, and I've also, Dave and I have been around different states, and Rhode Island is where I've been doing some work in prior years. And interestingly, as soon as the big money dispensaries got into the market here, all they've done with their money is lobby to keep those numbers just exactly where they are, so they don't lose their oligarchy. So in New York, we've got some of the big ROs that have come in, the medical ROs, that are big money, most of them, I would say. And I'm not, I check my facts on that, but I would say a lot of them are big ROs because you need registered organizations that operate in many states potentially, because they need the money to stay in the market for 3 years to kind of even turn a profit. Because our government, New York is, each state can regulate its own programs, so they can overregulate, and New York is kind of known for overregulating. But it's an interesting sort of, and I think New York also has, and I'm sort of seeing it at the national level now. I think our country's growing into a different generation. Right now the old is being pushed out, and the new and the progressive are being hopefully brought in. But there's a lot of pain, with that right now, and I see that in a more microscopic way in the cannabis world. It's like the old, and I don't want to say, the conservative, but there's the conservative politicians that are still very much in charge of the legislature here. that will, they control how the votes go, and it is very old school that way. But there's a lot of new folks that want to come in and change that. And it's sort of like this is one of those things that like, it really puts a highlight on, I think, that's those sort of camps, the old school versus the new school, and how are we going to get there. But I think until there's, big steps are tough for New York, and they're tough for any sort of big state with a lot of different diverse communities. So, the medical program's been really helpful. And I think there's still baby steps being made in the medical program that are sort of, once those steps are made, everything gets a little more, accepted by everyone. And the Savino-Gottfried bills, which have been sort of in the works for some time, and they're constantly, adding little pieces where they can add more conditions for the medical, or less, sort of less restrictions on the doctors to prescribe cannabis as a solution for your problems. So those baby steps actually really help the legislature move to a smaller and a little baby steps towards understanding and accepting and educating themselves. I think that's the real problem, is they don't know the benefits, and they've got these old. Dave was talking about the sort of the reefer madness, mentality still, that this is all evil and, it does harm, and it's the gateway drug for everything. And I think that stigma needs to be, and that just takes time, it takes time.
And on that, then, how do you're talking about education from a legislature point of view, and how do you address that coming down the kind of chains to just the everyday person on the street, or the restaurant owner, or a police officer? I mean, what is the attitude kind of on the ground towards, are people as open as we might think they are to accepting this, or is there a bit of butting heads over this?
So this
Well, I
is
think, yeah,
go
I
ahead.
was going to say, it depends on who you are. Like if you're a white female walking down the street in New York, you could go smoke a joint, and that cop's not going to stop you. But if you're a young, black male, that's the last thing you want to do in front of a cop, and you'd probably get, if you'd get busted for it even if you weren't doing it. And that's unfortunately, like, that's educating cops, that's retraining cops, that's sensitivity training, how to de-escalate situations rather than escalate situations. And that's like a psychology courses that a lot of these folks probably don't have that training. I think when it comes to sort of outwards, like educating the public, I think it's interesting to see, like, people of my parents' generation sort of accepting the medical benefits of cannabis after they've been to a seminar, or someone told them about it, or someone at their coffee shop, or their yoga studio or something. It sort of comes through a more of a different pipeline than it would normally come through. It would come through your yoga instructor, or your healer, or your nutritionist, or someone like that. And that's where, like, we have doctors on our board, and that's one of those things. I think it's really that profession, the medical profession, that has such prestige to bring the message and help us, understand what the benefits are. And I think it's just constant. It's a constant battle, it's a constant trying. And obviously there's, if we had big money behind us, we could be doing all sorts of messaging, social media, and, anything, everywhere, print and everything. But it's just a, constant battle, I think, I would say. Dave, what do you guys think on some of this topic?
Well, I think that the person on the street, there's more than 67% approval rate for legalization. So straight out of legalization, you've seen in different counties of New York City. New York City is divided into 5 boroughs, and the 2 most populous being Manhattan and Brooklyn. Both the district attorneys, who are the chief law enforcement officers for that borough, have said they will no longer prosecute low-level marijuana-related crimes. So people smoking a joint on the street technically is not supposed to be prosecuted, though, as Lizzie points out. Racism still runs deep in some communities, and that's an aspect that needs to be addressed either through policing and desensitivity and so forth. But I think that what we're starting to see is a generalized acceptance, and you can certainly literally smell it in the air as you're walking around now. And some of what we're seeing is not just through the medical related associations, but we're also seeing it where parents are all of a sudden realizing, maybe I had, a illegitimate view of this, because propaganda, they say crime doesn't pay, but it sure does if you criminalize something that shouldn't be, and you do it through propaganda. It has lasting impact through generations of thought policing, if you will. And so people are all of a sudden discovering that cannabis actually has been around for thousands of years. It has great therapeutic value. It has sacramental value for those that use it for religious experience. And it has limited impact for those that use it strictly as responsible use as an adult, just because they feel like it. So all of that needs to come out. So one of the biggest pushes in the education front is to try to engage the public in conversations about this. And as Andrew coined the phrase of our cannabis industry associations, that's so important is join the conversation. You know, we're here to dispel rumors. We're here to hear what people think is a concern to them and see how we can help them address that. And that's what we do. And we also, through our lobbying efforts, particularly through Lizzie, who is a master at getting government relations people involved in our organizations and our dialogue, you know, that's what we take on as a daily mission.
David mentioned Ehrlichman's quote from the Nixon administration. Nixon commissioned a report from a man named Schaefer. It's called the Schaefer Report. It was basically buried. And the object of the report was to find all the reasons why it should be classified as the most illicit drug out there, one with no medical use whatsoever. The report came back with conclusions that negated so much of the stigma that it was not only unusable, but it was actually it could be used as somebody speaking in favor of legalization. So so for example, a myth is it causes violence, and the report said no, there's no traceable thing to causing violence. And in fact, even from the first drug czar, Harry Anslinger, the United States drug czar, before he became anti-cannabis because he was originally anti-alcohol, that was his charge during Prohibition. His initial writings on cannabis was, that's all made up, like that it doesn't cause violence. And then he said the exact opposite when he started the propaganda campaign. So where does that take us to now? Why is that relevant now? I heard a story literally the other day of a health teacher explaining to a student that marijuana can kill you. You can overdose on marijuana. It's physically impossible. Now we know that, and I don't believe that the teacher is speaking out of malice or because
we heard it somewhere else and then repeated it.
We all grew up with it, and so what happens is and here just another data point. There's a really good treatise that does a lot of objective studies by 4 authors called Marijuana Legalization: What Everyone Needs to Know. One of the conclusions of one of the authors at the end of the book was, if you could reinvent society and just by way of example say which between alcohol and cannabis should be available and which should be restricted, hands down, the answer was alcohol, because scientifically, medically, alcohol is so much more dangerous for you. And some would argue, that cannabis, particularly if used responsibly, is not dangerous at all, and in fact has medical benefits. Medical programs how it started. But whereas you can walk into somebody's house and they'll offer you a martini, the first thing that happens when you sit down, and that's not only socially acceptable, it's expected. If somebody were coming to your house and you were to say, would you like a joint? 6 years ago, that would have been aghast. Oh my God, getting the vapors. Oh my gosh, But when you look at the reality, that's absurd. It is 100% absurd, because it is far more innocuous. And just another example, bartenders will tell you at 2 a.m., people in an argument, they're going to get into a fist fight. Same 2 people having been smoking pot all night, they're going to get into a policy discussion. Might be a little bit. It's just, and it's an exaggeration, but it demonstrates the point. All of this is self-evident to the people on this Zoom call. But there are really, really good people who do not have agendas, who just will instantly say things that have been disproven because nobody has ever engaged them in a way that's respectful.
Yeah.
Or they just haven't been engaged at all. People will shout back at them. And one of the missions of our association is never to shout back. Somebody shouts at you, says, this is bad for you, just say, why? Tell me why. And one other point, if you're against cannabis use and you want to restrict cannabis use, you should be for legalization. For a simple reason. It is so much harder for minors to get access to something that is legal and followed, like down a stream of commerce, and traced, and the ingredients are tested so that there's not some additive out there that could be very dangerous that somebody threw in because, for example, it enhances the plume or something like that, right? So my argument is, if you want to limit cannabis use and you want to restrict it and you want it to be safer, whether you're for it or against, legalization is actually the way to do it. Because if people are going to do it anyway, they should have access to it if it's safe, and they should have harder access to it if they shouldn't be getting it. That's the type of stuff that we want to educate about.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I really want to ask you as well, just about, with everything that's gone on this year, obviously there was a lot of talk about legalization in New York in particular before COVID was coming to take its grip on the world. Where do we stand now, and what are your expectations for 2021, looking at this as a whole? Is it going to be the year that everything kind of just, the floodgates open like we were talking about? Or, you know, give us an idea of where we're at the end of this year into next year.
Do you want to take that, David, or do you want me to?
Sure. Real quick. So the governor, as Lizzie was saying earlier, the governor has his own proposal, which he puts through in a budget, and the budget session that they negotiate over what the state's going to, extract in terms of revenue and expense takes place between January and April. And the governor will try to push his CRTA, which is the Cannabis Regulation Taxation Act, through in that time period. And then after that, should it not be successful, then the MRTA, which is a Marijuana Regulation Taxation Act that Lizzie also spoke about, which is a legislative proposal, will go through. I'm going to defer to her in a second, but I would say the COVID has been a sea change in so many ways, because we've seen a total sort of breakdown of the state economy and also the national economy, as well as the global economy. Cannabis, and particularly industrial hemp, which also comes out of it, and CBD and all the extracts that may be derived as cannabinoids, there's an industry there that is still nascent, particularly as far as New York's concerned, because it has only 10 operators that have been licensed so far in the medical cannabis space. So those are factors that are going to weigh in significantly on employment prospects for New York State, revenue prospects, and so forth. And again, as Andrew and Lizzie spoke about, in this conversation of social equity that has taken a whole new exponential life because of Black Lives Matter, this may be a means by which to employ those communities that, just as they were criminalized during the war on drugs, they are usually the last ones to be the recipient of infusion dollars from the government, particularly when dollars are scarce, like in a financial crisis that we're experiencing now. So with that, I'll turn to Lizzie and Andrew, but that would be my immediate projection, is it will be an extremely hot topic for 2021. And I think we will find legalization in that time period.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, I mean, I think when COVID hit and there was like zero state revenues, it really did become a topic of like, well, how do we solve this problem without raising taxes? And that was one of the things that, at least I think it certainly swayed, or would have swayed if it had been proposed, then a lot of folks that would have been on the fence, because they wasn't really a moral issue for them, but they realized here's a great way to raise revenues without tax, without an additional taxation on the people that already are not making any money and don't have their jobs and that kind of thing. So and what David alluded to, if the governor if they can pass it in the budget bill, which is like some 300 and some pages long, what's nice about having it in the budget is that there's a lot of legislators that can say, well, I had to vote for the budget. And that gives them cover in their local communities to be like, look, you can't not vote for the budget. So if it was sandwiched in there with, hundreds of other items, it's like they're getting cover, to make that vote, and they've got cover to make that vote. If it doesn't get passed in the budget, and then it does end up in the MRTA, it becomes then just a single standalone bill that will be subject to a lot more scrutiny, I would say. And that's where the advocacy groups come in, and there might be some discord among the advocacy groups, which does let the legislators sit back and say, oh, well, until these guys all get on the same page, and tell us what they want in the way of the social justice, social equity programs, what's going to work, what's not going to work, we don't have to do anything in a way, so they can sit back. So I think it sort of becomes, bifurcated that way, in the fact that if the governor can push it through if he wanted to, and then if he didn't, and if it got pulled out, we would end up sort of where we are, I think, a little bit today, that we need to get the advocacy groups on the same page. And how do they feel? When are they going to feel comfortable with what language, allowing then the rules to be promulgated that would allow for, sort of the redress of wrongs in the different communities? And that is going to be based on almost the local governments are going to have to decide that, because the state's not going to be able to say where in New York City was the worst, hit by this. So there's a whole level of then to have the local actual zoning comes in, because each local government can control its own zoning. But I mean, I think, getting to yes is we've always sort of said is getting to yes the main outcome, and without sort of ironing out all the details, which I know is, the devil's always in the details, but at least if we could get over that hump, it would give us the opportunity to address, how can we solve this problem and how can we make things right? And there are other states that have other programs that have been, sort of time will tell whether they've been successful, but there are other programs that have been well received among the advocates. So I think if we can get our advocates even in the same room, I mean, we can't even get them, it's hard sometimes to get everyone to
agree. Getting everyone to agree can be tricky. It doesn't matter if it's cannabis related or not.
Yeah, exactly, as we know. So so that's the tricky, but we're hoping as an industry association, we'll bring forward sort of, the economics of it, as well as, socially doing, trying to do programs like incubators and stuff where you can bring in, if the economy's section of it's working, you've got funds and you can then train people and do the things you want to do in the community, and then bring everybody up with the rising tide, rather than leave some folks behind, which I think that's what everyone's afraid will happen. And in a lot of states it has. So,
Andrew, do you want to have a final word on that?
Well, I think Lizzie tapped into a sort of core tenet of what we're trying to accomplish as associations. And this goes back, I remember actually, I don't know why, I know why it popped into my head. During the State of the Union speech years ago, I remember Obama talking about the discord in national policy. It might, actually, I don't know if it was State of the Union, it might have been a convention speech, probably more that. But the gist of it was, he said, we may not all agree on whether or not we're pro-choice or pro-life, for example. We may be divided on that, but we can all agree that this is something that we should treat as a public health issue, and that, fewer abortions are better if we can find other ways to deal with this, right? That was him tackling a third rail type of issue and basically saying, there are elements that we're not going to find common ground on, but somewhere in these two circles of thought, there's going to be overlap, right? What our associations, I think, try to do, and what we want to do, is help to find at least the center, what unifies us, and bring all those voices of advocacy together to find where we do have that center. So the easy example is, because most of the states did pass this by referendum, there was only one question on the ballot: do you want a legal market? Right? So if you were to stop and just ask that question to every advocate, the answer would be yes. And there, we have a unified voice on that single issue, right? Then you go down the scale, and there are many other issues where we actually do have a lot, where the disparate voices do have a lot in common in terms of what we want to accomplish. So what we want to do is basically be able to speak with one voice to the state and say, look, we're not saying we represent every point of view. We are saying that we have formed a consensus point of view about what we all agree is a good thing for a marketplace, right? And therefore, state, you need to take these organizations seriously, because we are speaking, on behalf of a collective that has found that center where our views do overlap, so that you at least have a core common set of beliefs that you can proceed from. The how you get there is where the challenge lies. But if we focus on how you get there without focusing on those things that unify us, then we look splintered from the state's point of view, and it does make it easier for a politician to sit back and say, well, if you guys are not able to tell us collectively what it is you want, then I can punt on this, right? And there's it's a debate, and there are many who would disagree with the point of view, that getting something now and then building on that is a good thing. Some people might say no, because if you go to a politician and you say, give me this, and they give you half of it, they're not going to give you the other half later, right? And I've talked about the fact that when the United States passed the Civil Rights Act, it had to pass the Voting Rights Act first. And part of President Johnson's law, was the community was very angry. The activists were very angry at him for not going for civil rights all at once, all in the first shot. His point was, we have to do it incrementally. We have to get the Voting Rights Act. Without that, we'll never get the Civil Rights Act. Now, that may be archaic. That may not work, but it's not a philosophy to ignore. It's one to study if you're going to figure out how best to help the advocacy group as a whole. So we're not saying we have the right answers, but what we are saying is we want to collect what we all agree are the right answers and at least start there.
And just to jump in for 1 second on this, because Andrew's laid it out so well, the goal of the cannabis industry associations, one for New York City, one for the Hudson Valley, their interests are not wholly aligned, because one may be a producer, one may be more of a consumer trade area, by region. But the goal of trying to hold this conversation and find the commonalities is then to reduce down those commonalities and also try to figure out what the rules of a legalized market should look like. Because the last people that should really be determining this are a bunch of politicians that are unfamiliar with the cannabis industry, the interests of the industry itself, and how best to promote it in a way that will not only continue the market on as it has existed, but allow it to really flourish going forward. And that is really one of the key driving forces that makes our cannabis industry associations completely different from other advocacy groups, because we're not just putting out a point of view, we're striving to actually create the reality. And that is critical. And it would not be possible without the input of Lizzie and Andrew and others that are part of our organization.
Just one thing to add to that. One of the other things I think a bit more unique is that we're not really, we do have obviously presentations and forums, but much of our work happens at the committee level where our members, one of the primary benefits of being a member is that you can be on a committee, for example, our regulatory committee. And so what we got together were groups of people who think, just as well as we do, to have their own conversation with us. And that group put together an amazing piece on taxation, talking about how we think the state should get it right. And that's going to go in our binder. We've already circulated that among legislators, but that's going to go in a binder of policy positions that our membership develops. And then, based on that, we figure out, okay, on this strand, for example, taxation, this is a healthy way to have a taxation structure that doesn't encourage the continuation of the legacy market. We want to bring it all under a legal market, for example. And we know that supply and demand and taxation all those three things go hand in hand. So we think it's really important not for people to dictate from the leadership of an organization, this is what we think, and therefore that's what it is. Actually, it's the opposite. It's ground up, and we want the thinking from our members, because it's only by them educating us and us educating each other that we can figure out what that common messaging is.
Liz, do you want to have a final word on that?
Yeah, I just want to add one thing about sort of what Andrew and the taxation memo, which we should share with you, is really informative, because I think what we've been talking about is New York, what's happening here in New York, and you mentioned this earlier, what's going to happen, what's the timeline look like for New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island's already, Rhode Island's on sort of where New York keeps deciding they're about to do it and then they don't, but Massachusetts did it. So New York could miss the boat, literally, if they don't get their act together and get this going, and their tax rate is 24%, and then we've got New Jersey over there with 14% and Connecticut with, something in the teens. Guess what? Everyone's just gonna be driving over the border to get it. So it's sort of, they need to get their act together, because the world around them is changing, and they're gonna miss the economic opportunity to grab the revenues if they don't get it together correctly. But the problem is, and our tax memo actually recommends a much lower tax rate than what they've been proposing in these bills, because with these bills, it's upward in like the high 20%, where then again, you're just letting the illicit market live. Because why am I going to go to the store, get out of my, when I can have the illicit guy deliver it to my door, for less? Why am I going to go spend more and register my name somewhere and have it out in the world that I'm buying weed, when I can do it from the comfort of my couch? So New York's got a lot of issues to deal with too, but it's also the fact that the other states are breathing down their necks right now, and get on board or just miss the boat. So.
welcome to this panel discussion, everything a consumer needs to know about CBD. What important things does a consumer need to know about CBD? So maybe I'll ask Moira first, as she has the CBD brand.
Okay, it's an important question, Bill. First of all, CBD may not be for everyone. For example, if someone is pregnant or breastfeeding, then there is no safety data on CBD. That doesn't mean it's not safe. It just means that the data is not there. Therefore, it's inadvisable to actually take CBD at that time. And there may be other reasons why. I would also mention that CBD should not contain THC, which is the psychotropic cannabinoid. And this is of real concern whilst the market is not regulated. So I'll come on in the next section to the licensing program that we are going through at the moment. Thirdly, the health benefits of CBD should be available without THC. And then lastly, people should be aware that there is an upper recommended limit of 70 milligrams per day. So that's about 28 drops of a 5% CBD tincture.
In terms of advice, I think it's very much down to the individual consumer. Now, Moira touched on the maximum daily dosage or usage. We can't refer to dosage because it's not a medicine. So we give some sort of clear guidance on the amount of usage that the consumer should take. But I think it's very much down to individuals and their endocannabinoid system and how each sort of sample that they take, how that interacts with them personally. So I think consumers should really experiment. Start with a low dosage, a low concentration of CBD in terms of if they're new to the category or to the industry, as it were. Start off with a 2.5% or 5% type of a product, and sort of start slowly and work their way up.